I used to think that there was hardly any possibility that this war would escalate to the nuclear level. Once it was clear that the Russians were not going to be defeated in eastern Ukraine, I relaxed with regard to this whole issue of nuclear escalation. But as I watch this war unwind at this point in time, I'm getting increasingly nervous that at some point nuclear weapons might be used. The Russians are angry. They are awfully angry. And if they cannot win quickly on the battlefield, I mean, you and I anticipate that they will wrap this war up on the battlefield reasonably soon. But let's assume that I'm wrong and it just takes a lot more time. And you have more and more operations like this and the Kursk offensive. The incentives for the Russians to escalate are very great. And the Russians might very well think about using a nuclear weapon. And especially in Ukraine, because Ukraine doesn't have the capability to retaliate. I'm not saying that that's likely. All I'm saying is that we're marching forward here into a world where the Russians are getting increasingly angry with us. They're getting increasingly desperate about where this one is headed over the long term. And when that kind of thing happens, states take risks. They pursue risky policies. So we do not want to underestimate the extent to which we're playing with fire. And again, this is a point that General Kellogg made. And Kellogg usually supports hook, line, and sinker, anything that the Ukrainians do. But he understands, as I do, that this is not a good situation. You do not want to back the Russians into a corner.
Well, yeah, and you talked about Russians being angry. Some of the things they've said, and at least what they say on their media, is the reason for why they call some of this stuff terrorism. They go back to the Kursk operation, and the incursion itself is part of war. But they say what they did to the civilian population was terrorism. And then, as one of our viewers here points out there, they say this railroad attack was on a passenger train here coming in. What do you say to those claims?
Well, it was, an attack on a railroad train that had civilians, and a good number of civilians were killed. You can call that a terrorist attack if you want. But the point is, the more important point here is that the Ukrainians are escalating, and they're escalating by attacking inside of Russia. Remember, last year, they launched a massive ground offensive into Mother Russia. And we supported that invasion. And now we're talking about going after strategic nuclear forces on the Russian side. And of course, as you just pointed out, or as the person who's watching the show just pointed out, we are attacking bridges as well inside of, or the Ukrainians are attacking bridges inside of Russia. And in one case, they hit a train that was filled with civilians. And this is just designed to provoke the Russians. If you listen to what Putin says, he's telling Trump that he's going to retaliate, period. And it's quite clear that Trump can't do anything to change Putin's mind. And I think in the past, Putin was much slower to take the bait and to move towards escalation. But he's reached a point, in good part because he's under tremendous pressure on the home front to put an end to this, to escalate. He's going to escalate. We don't know exactly what that escalation will look like, but it could be really serious. And that, of course, will give us an incentive to escalate, and certainly give the Ukrainians an incentive to escalate.
That's exactly my concern here. And Gary, let's go ahead and put that Truth Social up on the screen here for anybody who may not have seen it. I want to read the first half of it right now. The whole thing we're going to talk about during this comment, because there's also some important stuff in the second half to discuss. But first of all, he says, Trump says, I just finished speaking by telephone with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. The call lasted approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes. We discussed the attack on Russia's docked airplanes by Ukraine and also various other attacks that have been taking place by both sides. It was a good conversation. Strange use of the term there, but not a conversation that will lead to immediate peace. President Putin did say and verify and very strongly, getting into your point there about being angry, that he will have to respond to the recent attack on the airfields. And then he shifts into Iran. We'll get on to that in a minute. But that is what's striking to me there, John, as much as what he said is what he didn't say, meaning Trump. He didn't say anything that I tried to talk him out of it, I asked him not to, or asked him to limit. Maybe he did behind the scenes, but at least in what he's talking about here, it's more like he's just saying matter-of-factly, yeah, something's coming. How do you read it?
Before I answer that question, I wonder whether Putin asked Trump whether he knew the attack was coming.
But by the way, just to let you know, I actually just a few minutes ago got a text from a source that I have inside of Kiev that had some connections to the administration. They claim that in this conversation that Putin did ask him that and that Trump said no, he didn't know about it. So take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, you would expect Trump to say that, although it may be true.
Right. That's the problem.
Yeah, which is a problem in itself. Right. I would say two things about this, Danny. First of all, as you know, when Trump writes on Truth Social about anything that's happened, he invariably spins it in the most positive way. He did not do that here. He said it was a good conversation. That is not Trump-like language. He usually would say it was a tremendous conversation. We're making real progress. It was nothing more than a good conversation. Furthermore, the conversation lasted an hour and 15 minutes. When you take into account that translation is involved, that's not a lot of time. And I think this is basically a short conversation. I think it was a cold conversation. And I think that Putin went to great lengths to convey to Trump that he's had it and he's going to play hardball from here on out, regardless of what Trump or the Europeans or the Ukrainians say.
I'm going to have to ask you to speculate a little bit because, I mean, we don't have anything to go by, but just what do you think is the range of possibilities? What might Putin do in response?
I think, Danny, a lot depends on the battlefield. I think if they are on the verge of launching a major offensive and they're confident that they can roll up the Ukrainian forces quite quickly, the incentive to do anything major is not very great because you can let events on the battlefield do the talking for you. But if they anticipate launching this major offensive that we expect in a month's time, and they expect that it will play itself out over a couple months' time, that will put powerful incentives on them to do something. I think spectacular is too big a word or too powerful a word, but something demonstrative, clearly demonstrative, sooner rather than later. And then I think you're talking about the Russians picking out one or two or three, major targets and putting missiles on those targets and destroying them completely, and sending a very clear message to the Ukrainians that they better stop what they're doing.
And one would imagine that since Russia is really famous for tit for tat, going back even into the Soviet period, that if a strategic asset was struck here, that we might expect some kind of a strategic asset on the other side to be hit. Do you have any kind of an idea of what a strategic that hasn't been attacked so far that might be added to a target list to be commensurate?
Well, when you use the word strategic with me, I'm thinking of the strategic nuclear forces. I'm thinking of the triad, and that would really involve going after the American triad. I find it hard to imagine that the Russians would be foolish enough to do that. They'd have to do it themselves. I mean, in this case, it was the Ukrainians who did it for us, so to speak. I find it hard that the Russians would do something like that. I also find it hard to imagine that the Russians would hit a target in, say, Germany or Poland.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's possible that they could hit a target in Poland or Romania, but I think
probably not at this stage, I would guess. I should have known better than to talk to an international theorist and not use proper or precise definitions. When I said strategic on the Ukraine side, of course, they don't have any nuclear stuff. So I meant strategic in terms of something that's really important at the national level. So sorry for my lack of being accurate.
I think the target would be inside of Ukraine. And, I mean, they could talk about taking out a major airport or two or three major airports inside of Ukraine. They could warn everybody to leave and then put some of their most formidable weapons on those airports. I mean, I'm not saying they will do this by any means, but something like that could happen. I think the Russians will want to send a powerful message, and that will involve hitting a target that really matters to the Ukrainians.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking too. That's what my gut tells me. And the fact that, and the call didn't say, or the readout didn't say who initiated this call, whether it was Putin or Trump. I would guess it was Putin. I'd like to see that, because that could imply that he's being proactive, and that would imply that you're probably going to be right there. To put both these comments, the Trump and the Putin comments, in context, I want to back up just a little bit, because I think that they're related here. In the last few days, or toward the end of last week, they had the meeting, or I'm sorry, toward the first of this week, they had the meeting in Istanbul, to where it was more theater than it was any kind of diplomatic situation, where both sides came with a memorandum that they knew the other side would reject. And sure enough, the Ukraine side put forth their demands, which they knew for sure that Russia would reject, because Russia's already said categorically they're against them. A ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire leading the path, and then a direct talk with the heads of state before anything's been resolved. Obviously, they're not going to do that. After that had been delivered there, then Volodymyr Zelensky went out really cockily and said this.
I informed our partners about the situation at the front. We also talked about our operation inside Russia, which has seriously weakened their military. Operation Spiderweb showed that modern war really looks like, and why it's so important to stay ahead with technology. The key to lasting peace is clear. The aggressor must not receive any reward for war. Putin must get nothing that would justify his aggression. Any reward would only show him that war pays off. Geopolitical gains are just as important to Russia as money or territory. If Putin is allowed to decide who joins NATO, where NATO infrastructure can or can't be, then Russia's appetite for war will only grow.
So to me, Russia's appetite for war against Ukraine will grow with comments like that, because he's talking like he's the superior talking to an inferior, and he can force Russia into peace. Obviously, that they don't have any cards or leverage to be making these demands. But what impact do you think these kind of comments have on Russia?
Well, I think the Russians have made it clear. A number of high-level Russian policymakers have said, if you take the deal that's on the table, we will take the 4 oblasts that we have annexed plus Crimea, but nothing more. However, if you don't take the deal, the war will go on and we will take more territory. And of course, as you and I have talked about many times, not only will the Russians take more territory, they'll kill more Ukrainians. And given that the United States is not willing to back Ukraine to the hilt in the future, that Donald Trump is not Joe Biden, it's quite clear that they will lose a lot more territory and that this is not to their advantage. But as you well know, this is Zelensky's modus operandi. He just refuses to make any concession. He keeps playing to the hawks in the West, both the United States and Europe. He's been quite successful with some major qualifications involving Trump. But all this just tells me that the war is going to go on and Ukraine is going to end up in much worse shape in a year or two than it's in now.
Well, and to your point, the Russian UN ambassador Nabinzia actually went out just a couple of days ago and put a really fine point on what you just said.
As long as Kyiv tries to prolong the war and provoke Russia by striking residential and civilian infrastructure on our territory, we will continue our special military operation and destroy objects associated with the military potential of the Kyiv regime. And no new anti-Russian sanctions, arms supplies to Ukraine, or other hostile steps towards Russia will prevent the inevitable military defeat of the Zelensky regime. The choice is now up to Ukraine. Peace as a result of negotiations or inevitable defeat on the battlefield with different conditions for ending the conflict.
You see, he's black and white there. It's either negotiations or a military defeat on the battlefield. And probably a silly question because you've kind of already alluded to it, but do you believe that the Russians have the military capacity to reach a full military defeat on the Ukraine side?
I don't think that they will ultimately attempt to fully defeat Ukraine, because that would involve trying to conquer all Ukraine. And I think the Russians would be remarkably foolish to try to conquer the western half of Ukraine. And I think everything that they've said up to now indicates that they accept that logic. However, as both you and I know, escalation in wartime is a very tricky business. And it could be the case that if the Ukrainian military crumbles, the Russians move in to fill the vacuum and end up conquering almost all or all of Ukraine. I think that's highly unlikely, but it is possible. But it would not be smart from a Russian point of view. But I think the choice here is either you lose the 4 oblasts plus Crimea, which means accepting Russian terms now, or you continue to fight, and you'll probably lose at least 4 more oblasts. For some reason, the Ukrainians and the Europeans and many Americans seem to think that the Russians can be stymied, if not defeated. I find it unfathomable that people come to that conclusion when you think about the nature of this war, a war of attrition, and you look at the balance of forces on both sides. The balance of forces overwhelmingly favor the Russians, and the Ukrainian position has only been deteriorating with time, and there's no evidence that anybody has a magic formula for rectifying this situation. You know, you talk about these attacks on these bomber bases, and we don't know for sure how many bombers they destroyed, but even if they destroyed a lot of them, does this really matter on what's happening on the battlefield? Nobody tells that story. They simply say that this was a significant military victory. It's the new form of warfare. It shows you that the Ukrainians can hang in there, that the Russians are in trouble, and so forth and so on. These are just platitudes. Please explain to me how these weapons make a difference. I just don't understand. The destruction of these weapons makes a difference on the outcome of this war.
Yeah, it's without question. It was painful. It was unpleasant. But Russia has, I think the number I've seen is like 87 or 80 some odd of these strategic bombers. So even if the loss of a lot of them were claimed, and there's a lot of dispute on that from satellite imagery, they have a lot of other carriers that can handle it. Ergo, the pace and the saturation of that these the aircraft were already used to bring, like Caliber and Kinzhal and other kinds of cruise missiles, that won't change because Russia still has plenty of others to continue on really without pause. So that validates really what you're saying there. I want to shift slightly to kind of partially going back to what Trump put in that Truth Social, or what he implied rather, was that he doesn't want this war to expand. He certainly has said that in many cases before. And as Professor Michael Clark of King's College said earlier today, he pointed out that the U.S. doesn't want it to escalate because they probably couldn't fight and win one anyway.
The idea of using American firepower explicitly against Russia is almost completely off the table with Trump.
So that's interesting. And Putin would, of course, know that because Putin, the ex-spy, would have calculated, would have worked it out, and perhaps knows that there is a threshold. But it's interesting, isn't it, Michael? Because that threshold, from what Petraeus was saying, even in the event that nuclear weapons are used, the response from the most powerful country on earth under Petraeus or under Biden would not be to go nuclear either, because they know that is a threshold that you just can't couldn't cross.
But if a nuclear weapon were used, you couldn't ignore it. You couldn't say, well, that's unfortunate.
I agreed with most of that until the last end there, and I'm not automatically convinced of the last part, that if nuclear weapons were used in here, and I agree with you that at least as of the moment, it's still not that likely. But I think that the U.S. at least should recognize that to use any nuclear weapons, even if they are there, and invite a retaliation on our territory should be a no-go area of even consideration. How do you see it?
Oh, for sure. There's no way the United States would initiate nuclear use. I mean, the only side that might initiate nuclear use in some circumstance in the future is Russia. And that's because Russia can use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, and Ukraine cannot retaliate. And the United States will not retaliate for Ukraine. So in a very important way, the Russians, if they were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, would not have to worry about nuclear retaliation. During the Cold War, if you hypothesized a situation where either the United States or the Soviet Union used nuclear weapons first, you always had to take into account that the other side would retaliate. It was axiomatic. But this is a very different situation because Ukraine is the battleground and Ukraine itself doesn't have nuclear weapons. And again, we wouldn't use nuclear weapons on behalf of the Ukrainians. But I don't think that's likely to happen at the moment. But, you know, I've said this before on the show, Danny, you want to remember that there are a number of flashpoints involving the Russians in Eastern Europe that go beyond the Ukraine war. One is the Arctic, 2 is the Baltic, 3 is Kaliningrad, 4 is Belarus, 5 is Moldova, and 6 is the Black Sea. You can imagine conflicts breaking out, say in the Baltic. If you follow what's going on every day in the Baltic, it's getting very sketchy there. And if you think about the Arctic, the potential for trouble up there is great. You have 8 countries that are physically located in the Arctic, 7 of them are NATO countries. The one that isn't is obviously Russia. And you can easily imagine, I'm not saying again it's likely, but you can imagine a war breaking out in the Arctic or a war breaking out in the Baltic. And in those cases, if the Russians are in desperate straits, I wouldn't be surprised if they use nuclear weapons. Is it likely? Again, no. But it just shows you how dangerous the world is that we're moving into, or maybe dangerous it is, how dangerous this world that we're in is.